Chance Lyman joins us from down in Delta. He's come up here before, shared information with us, and he's still with it, still doing it, and we appreciate Chance coming up here to share some of his experiences recently as things go, as he's been going forward trying to implement soil health. If you recall from the video, he was kind enough to let me come invade his privacy for a while to do that video. So we want to thank Chance for coming, and I'm going to let him take it from there.
Well, thank you. I welcome the opportunity to speak in events like this. It's one of these things that gets you out of your comfort zone, but the one thing I enjoy about speaking at soil health conferences is the fact that we get to network. I think that's, in all reality, what makes these things click and what makes them function. I was doing all right until Tony said this is going to be videoed, so I have to give a disclaimer. My disclaimer is that I grew up running equipment, moving dirt, excavation. I currently now am in agriculture. My mainstay is cattle. In both of those, there is a commonality, and that is the fact the way we communicate. Both in excavation and moving cows, there's two forms of communication. You yell and scream, and you cuss and swear. So, you've been warned that any time in this presentation, I may cuss and scream and yell and swear. So, again, I welcome the opportunity. I think it's a fun event. My wife and I together, we run West Desert Land and Livestock. Along with my father-in-law, we rent cattle and land from him. We're currently at 300 head of mother cows and just under 500 acres in agricultural production. So that keeps one guy like myself busy, but not busy enough if you can see the shape I'm in. But I want to talk a little bit about what I'm doing on my operation, in the fact that what I do for me may not be applicable for you. Today we listened to Keith Barnes, Dwayne Beck, both of which in their presentations talked about principles of soil health. And Dwayne Beck especially stood out to me. He says there's principles that need to be applied, but the methods or the way that you apply them should be meant to you, should be catered to you in your operation. So I hope today that with what I have to share, it's something that strikes a note to you that maybe you can do something different, but not exactly the same as what I'm doing. You know, if you look at the picture on the screen, I think in agriculture it's easy to say that we get stuck in insanity. We do the same thing every year. We get the tillage equipment out, we get the herbicides ready, we get the sprayer ready. We've got the same routine day in and day out, expecting different results. And I think that's where we're at, is we're stuck. So going back to the fact that there are many principles, there's 5 principles of soil health, all of which I'm going to explain how I manipulate or how I add them into my operation. I want you to take into consideration this quote by Harrington Emerson. He knew back in the early 1800s, 1900s, that there are many ways to do things, but there are the basics that get you started. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. If you don't believe me, everybody thinks, well, I cannot implement these soil health principles on my place. I want to show to you that even as kids, there were soil health principles practiced with us or the way you treat your children. The 5 principles are applied in this way. The first one, minimal disturbance. As long as we left mom and dad alone, things were good. We all know that. We all experienced that. When we didn't leave mom and dad alone, we were looking for anything and everything to cover our ass. Number 3, keep a living root. Now, I'm the oldest of 5 kids. We always had something growing. We always had something cup underneath me. And it's a good thing we did, because I appreciated the diversity. Because at any time any one of us got in trouble, it was always someone else's fault. Number 5, integrating livestock. It's inevitable. If we've got livestock on any operation, or you apply livestock into kids' life, it definitely changes their attitude really quick. So I want you to understand that any way you look at it, it can be applied to anything in life. Now, this is how I've applied it. If we keep doing the same thing we've always done, we're going to get the same results that we've always gotten. I was sitting one evening with my kids watching the Lorax. Now, watching the Lorax, some of us might think, being here in Utah, that it's one of those liberal, leftist, environmental movies. But I'm here to say that it's applicable to what we're doing. Unless someone like us actually takes the initiative to make a change, nothing's going to get any better. I mean, we listened to Keith's presentation about carbonomics. It takes that one person to make a motivation or a drive in the right direction to make it work. So this is how I've taken these 5 principles on my operation and integrated into each one of my systems: hay, small grains, livestock. So I started in 2015. I started with 3-way cover crop integrated or interseeded with clover. That was my start. We've seen success, so we carried on into the fall. After that 3-way and clover was taken off, I planted a multi-species cover crop. I had 15 species in this mix. You can see legumes, grasses, brassicas, broadleafs. You can also see I had 15 different species, planted at 47 pounds, which cost me $37 to the acre. A lot of you might not think that that's economical, but I'll show you in this presentation how I was able to return investment to my operation. So this was the results, what we've seen in the first year. We were able to see earthworm activity. We were able to keep residue, incorporate residue, and get that biology fed so that we can start utilizing it and using it on our operation. In Delta, we farm on high salinity, clay soil. Our pH sits around 8, 8.5 is normal for us. Organic matter is 1 to 1.5%. That's on a good side. And I would say the majority of our field's barely touching 1%. So I started out with 120 acres, following 3-way. You can see where my windrows were with 3-way, kind of the difference between having too much seed in one spot versus another. Now this particular field here, I'm going to talk in reference 2 or 3 pictures back and forth of why this field stands out. This field here laid fallow for several years. What made it special to me and what I was known to be my aha moment in all of this is that I had cattle in some brush ground on the perimeter of this field. I kept getting scours in my calves, and I kept having problems finding my calves, doctoring and taking care of them. So what I did is I pulled them cows off of that brush ground and then started feeding them on this ground here. And you can see the growth, you can see the nutrients is there. There's no deficiencies that we know of. There's no discoloration in plants. We've just barely had a touch of frost, and that's why you see the Sudan grass kind of wilting. We've gone through, we've analyzed our bad spots. Those are the spots that we're trying to work on. Not everything's perfect, but we are seeing that those spots are getting tighter and tighter. We don't have as much of the saline spots as we started out with. Okay, so this is what I want to point out in this field 2 pictures back of what made it special. When everybody thinks of a cover crop, the first thing they talk about is radish and the size of radishes. I could care less about the size of radish until I saw this picture. There's 5 different radishes there. Each one of those radishes are taken off of a different field out of that 120 acres. If you look at the 2 radishes on the left, those fields that those radishes were taken out of had minimal integration of livestock. So what we would do is we'd bring the cows home in the fall, we'd graze off the alfalfa, and that was the only time that it saw any kind of integration with livestock. That spindly radish there in the middle, that's out of a hay field that had no integration of livestock whatsoever. That field is a new field that we had bought, my wife and I together, and that was the first rotation out of hay in almost 20 years. That radish on the far right come out of the field that had laid fallow for several years, and then I started feeding my cows on prior to planting this cover crop. So when you talk about the carbonomics or economics behind it, such as Keith was talking about, you start to see the effects of biology and what that biology would do to these plants. That radish right there on the far right tells me that I've got a good biology background, that it's starting to kick in, it's starting to feed those plants, and you start to see the growth because of it. Now, I did not pick this picture because of the model. Beyonce wasn't available this day, so I was all you had in this picture. But I wanted to show the growth after 45 days. This field was planted about the 1st of August, and we had not received our first killing frost yet. This was just a little bit before our first killing frost. You know, we're happy. This is standing out in that field that had laid fallow for several years, and then we went in and started feeding cattle on that ground prior to this cover crop. This particular picture here is out of the field that had three-way clover and then come into the fall cover crop. What stands out to me in this picture is this picture was taken after a rainstorm. In Delta, if you were to go out there, walk through your field in the rain, you would gain in height 2 inches because of all the clay that's stuck to the bottom of your feet. When I went out to take this picture, I didn't have anything stick to the bottom of my feet. And if you notice, the clump of soil is wet from top to bottom. So after a significant rainstorm, we started to see infiltration. You start to see the soil open up, aggregate, or flocculate is another word for it. And we start to see that infiltration. You also start to see worm activity. Again, if I had the opportunity to pick a better model, I would have done it. But the reason I picked this picture is for that piece of rebar that I'm holding up in my hand. This picture is taken again out of that field that I had laid fallow and then come back in and fed cattle on, planted the cover crop. What's so special about that piece of rebar is that it's 4 feet long. And this is what I use to hang my hot fence on, is I'll use rebar and a plastic insulator, and I'm usually under $1 a post when I do that versus a fiberglass is at $2. But I was able to take that rebar when we took this picture this day and shove it in the ground almost to the 4-foot depth of that rebar. And in Delta, if you were to do that on any good field, or what was classified as a good field, it'd usually bounce back in your face. So that was another aha moment for me, is the significance of biology, opening up that ground and what it was able to do. Because when I started with this, I did not disc, I didn't till, I didn't rip, and that's usually what the tradition is in Deltas. They'll go in, do deep tillage, and then plant in succession after that. So I mentioned that my operation is cattle. This is what I've done with the cattle, implementing the cover crops. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it's done for us in this regard. This particular picture was taken the 25th of January. Now I'm going into 3rd trimester on pregnancy in January. Minimal feed requirement or protein requirement is 12%. On this particular field, I'm sitting at 13% protein, so I've met or exceeded my minimum. I'm happy with that. The other thing I'm looking at is on this particular sample, we were starting out at 8.1. We brought that pH down to 7.8. I'm not really concerned about the organic matter because depending on how you pull your sample, you can get a little bit more organic matter or less. But there was an increase. Some argue that you can see the increase as quick as we did. I'm not saying that that's a stable increase. But if you look where them cattle are grazing, you can still see green down there by the feet of the cattle. So they've got a well-balanced diet in front of them. Not only are they getting the nutritional requirement, but they're getting that balance. So they can slow that protein down as it's digested with that carbohydrate that yellow plant provides as well. What they're grazing? That's that 15 or 17 species mix. So there's fall grain, spring grain. The green stuff is there's a little bit of cereal rye mixed in with some collards and some brassicas, radish, things like that. So going back to the importance of biology and feed value, this cow is grazing on that field that I laid fallow, come back and fed on, and then planted the cover crop with. So if you look at the protein in this field, I'm sitting at 19% protein on feed value on the 25th of January. Again, you look at your pH, the pH is high in the spring, it's lowered in the winter. So a lot of people, when we start talking about cover crops, I notice the number one concern is where do I see my value? Keith explained a lot today about the carbonomics that goes behind the biology, what is put back into the soil. I started to see it on my own operation the first year. So again, like I said, we're planting 47 pounds at $37 per acre, and some of you might seem that that's a little high or excessive. But if you look at what I'm getting on that $37, I can't replace it with iron. First and foremost is deep tillage. Like I said before, is when we go into a rotation, the first thing we do is we pull out the deep ripper. We're ripping anywhere from 18 to 24 inches. This particular radish right here measured over 24 inches from tip to tail. So I'm getting and accomplishing my deep tillage with just a radish. Sugar beet's the same thing. The one on the far right is a forage collard. Now this particular radish here has a story behind it. This one took the tour around town. It ended up in the cafe for about a week. But the best story I got for Radish is my father-in-law. This is all new to him. He's been farming. The concept is not something that he's grasped too easily, but easing into. But he got excited when we started seeing radishes of this size, and so he went out to the field, gathered up a radish, took it home, and put it on the shelf. He was expecting to show this radish off to one of his friends that was coming up to visit that following week that he dug it. So I'm outside saddling my horse. We're still trying to get cows moved, fall of the year. I could hear the door close to his house. I'm out to the tack shed, and I can hear mumbling. Now, we're all farmers. We all talk to ourselves. It's not an uncommon practice. But he was arguing with himself. So it got to be interesting, and all I could hear is, that damn woman. And he repeated it a couple times, that damn woman. So finally he gets over and he starts saddling his horse, and I couldn't take it. I says, well, what's the matter? He says, that damn woman ate my radish. So it was a little disappointing, needless to say, but my mother-in-law, she's from Thailand, and so over there, this is part of dinner for her. So she saw that radish sitting there on the bookshelf. It come natural to her. So it's been fun. It's been exciting. The other return on investment is the nitrogen. Keith talked about, the rhizobia bacteria that creates the biology effect to produce nitrogen. This is, if you look up there in that clod, you start to see nitrogen nodules on both of them. That's coming off a hairy vetch. At this particular mix, I didn't inoculate. This ground here has been in grass. It's never seen legumes that I know of. And so to see that the first year, not saying that it's sustainable, but the opportunity that you see things like this changing just furthered the momentum. So there are values to organic matter. We learned a lot about that today, but what I'm tired of is trying to catch a market that's always changing. There's always a fad, whether it's all natural, organic, black, it's got to be black, it's got to be this, it's got to be that. It comes and goes. I've tried chasing those markets. But what I've found is that where you look up there, they've actually placed a value to organic matter. For every percent of organic matter, it returns you $750 for every percent per acre. When you start looking at that, the other thing that organic matter does is it starts retaining water. For every percent of organic matter, you can retain 26,000 gallons of water per acre. And when we're irrigating, in my situation, we're flood irrigating, so we're losing ours to evaporation before it even gets to our field. A lot of you guys that are pivot irrigating, when you start saving 26,000 gallons of water per acre, that's less pumping costs. So when you start looking at other ways to see return on investment, it starts to make sense. And when it starts making sense, you start making money. But this is usually the way we find ourselves in agriculture, is that we find something interesting, we got to go get our friend, don't we? Get him involved, and then friend gets involved, and then we got to go get another friend. So, that's why I enjoy coming to these events like this, is because it gives us an opportunity to see that there are guys out there. We are trying. It's not always the best. We do find trend wrecks, but it's one of those things that you can pick yourself up and move on. So in our area, what I've found that the biggest gripe is that we're primarily a dairy hay market. And so these guys say, well, it won't work in my area. It won't work in my operation. You're right, it won't. If you're not even going to put the mainstay behind it and try it, it'll never work. So what I did is I took my operation and I started saying, okay, I'm a feed guy. I don't necessarily have to have the best feed, so if it doesn't work, I can just feed it through my beef cows and be all right. But what I found is this particular picture here is taken Thanksgiving Day. We heard the principle of having a living root in the soil at all times. If you look at that middle picture, you can barely see green in the middle of it. That's a living root November, Thanksgiving Day. And then the outside pictures are what's growing in there. I had some grasses, I had collards, I had radishes, just something that I know that would extend my growing season and keep that cycle going. And you look at those pictures and you think there really isn't anything that come of it, but it's the small and simple things that make it better. And again, the Lorax, it's really not that liberal. But what stood out in the alfalfa the most is that if you look at the picture on the left, you look down there in the bottom, this picture is taken at ground level. There's very few leaves that are discolored, that are changing, that are wilted, that are falling off. And if you actually look through the whole picture, I only see one leaf right up there, about the second TV down, is where the bugs actually started eating on that plant. Now, what's interesting about this picture is that if you look at the right, look at all the leaves in the bottom, all the discoloration, all the leaves at least have a bug that's eaten or touched that leaf. You start to see the soil after the first year in alfalfa. This picture right here is this field and this field. So this is the field that had the cover crop in it. That's the field that didn't. The only thing that separates those two is that irrigation dike right there. If you look at the field on the right, look at that yellow tint that it's got. That's our number one nemesis in alfalfa hay and Delta is tansy mustard. If you look at the one on the left, you'll be hard-pressed to find 2 sprigs of tansy mustard in that whole field. The one on the left wasn't sprayed with herbicides, it wasn't sprayed with pesticides, and it wasn't fertilized. The field on the right wasn't sprayed with herbicides or pesticides, but it was synthetically fertilized. The only difference in yield between those 2 hay fields was 1 ton for the whole season. Not 1 ton per acre, but 1 ton over 20 acres. So when I started looking at return on investment for $37 over 1 ton, I can take a 1 ton loss and still be profitable. Yep. So after first crop. Yep. So what I did is after first crop, I interseeded that mix in there, let it go for the whole growing season. My objective or my goal with this is that I wanted to get rid of clover root curculio. It has the same effects as a stem root nematode. So my goal was to fumigate. In there I planted mustard, I planted Fuma radish, I planted tiller radish, and I planted Sudan grass as a base. That was my fumigation process. That's what I did to eliminate the stem root nematode problem. Nope. I just let it go and I brought the cows home and grazed it. I did. Yep. So this is an aerial picture of these 2 fields right here. You see the field on the left and the field on the right. See the dark green strip right there? That's the field that had the cover crop. The field right next to it is that alfalfa that had the tansy mustard in it. All of those fields around are all alfalfa. So you see down here in the bottom with the red checkered around it, same principle. I planted cover crop in the dark green, alfalfa right next to it. So it can be done. I've done it 2-3 years now. So every year after that, actually, to be honest with you, I plant cover crop in every acre that I have every year. So I don't just set aside 40 acres. But if I go talk to a producer now, to get them eased into it, I will encourage them to at least start with 10 acres, 20 acres, or whatever it may be. Call it the sacrificial acres. After first crop's usually our bumper crop of hay. Then we start dwindling down to about ton and a half. Third crop, we're only getting a ton. So for me, on the beef side of it, I was able to graze it. I estimated I had about a ton to a ton and a half feed there, closer to a ton and a half when I grazed. I really didn't lose anything on my operation. I irrigated it twice. So on alfalfa, it depends on our area. Small grains are anywhere from 18 to 25 days in between irrigations. Alfalfa, if we get it irrigated once in between cutting, we're doing pretty good. First crop we'll irrigate twice. No, we have storage. We've got storage capability, so we call for it anytime we need it. Yep. No, as you can see, it's actually made it better. So like I said, my operation's different. I have the windfall that if something goes wrong, I just turn the cows out. Now, this last year or two, we've been able to integrate some of it into some dairy hay and shipped it to California. We haven't got the results back on it yet, but it's positive that they're going to let us keep doing it. Yeah, I got a no-till drill. Yep. So, this is what I've started to do with my cattle. This picture on the left is after I plant a cover crop, I come in and graze it, and I know that one of the principles is soil armor. But my objective is I want to get as much biology, as much nutrients on that field as I can. So what I've done here is I've come back in after I've grazed that cover crop, and then I start feeding my cattle on one side of the field and moving across just like I'm spreading manure. I mean, that's their job. I mean, they were born with 4 legs and a mouth, and necessarily it wasn't for me to bring them food, so they've got to repay themselves. But on the one on the right is what I started doing with bale grazing. And to be honest with you, I think going forward, I would much rather do more of the bale grazing as I would just windrow feeding like this. A lot of guys, you look at the residue that's there and the litter that's on the ground, they think that is a waste, but after you'll see here in a minute, it's not a waste. So, this picture here is significant, is if you look down the middle of the screen, you can see a distinct line in that picture. That line is everything to the right is where I was feeding my cattle and moving across the field. At that line is where I stopped feeding my cattle and moved them somewhere else. If you look at the 2 pictures on the left, notice the top left, you see the color deficiency in those plants. That's usually a lack of biology because they're not exchanging back and forth to get that nutrients. If you look at the one on the top right, there's really no discoloration. And that's what you get with that interchange of nutrients, or the benefit of mycorrhizal fungi. So that picture on the right is taken on this side of the field. The picture on the left is on this side. Now the bottom 2 is grazing that volunteer cover crop the next spring. These cattle are on this cover crop about the 20th of May, 20th of May. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see cattle. I would pay anybody $100 if they can count the number of cattle in that cover crop on the right. There is cattle over there. And it's taken at that line in the field where you can see the line there, that growth. That's where I come back after I grazed the cover crop and fed back on that ground. So this is the results, or this is what I'm seeing with the bale grazing side of it. The bottom right-hand corner, again, is a picture of cattle. You see the litter, the residue, the manure. The top right is corn stalks. I had a heavily traveled area there, and I wanted to eliminate compaction as much as possible. So I took a higher carbon crop, such as the corn, and got that mat down so that they weren't compacting that soil. And that's just what they're looking like grazing over here. I like this picture in the bottom corner because it's a picture of my boy. This is a cow, a mother cow now, but it's a bucket calf that we had raised. He's sitting there petting the cow. You notice the dog up in the corner there. Oh, come on, let me pet him. I just want to pet him. Let me pet him. That's what he's thinking. So, you start integrating these, you start getting out there with these cattle, and it makes all the difference in the world. But, again, you look at the application of that principle, you look at that turnip. That turnip was grown with no added nutrients. That was grown in that spot up there where them cattle are standing after I bale grazed. It's bigger in my head. I measured it. Cost. I reduced my costs. When I bale graze, I only have to go out and haul feed to them cows every other day. I'm not feeding every day. My ideal situation is I would go out and set up a field in the fall, put all my hay bales out there in order, and move hot fence every day, and then I won't have to fire up a tractor during the winter. It does. You'd be surprised. And I actually feed less feed. I was feeding on bale grazing. So my average on feed is I want about 30 to 35 pounds per head per day. I'm more at the 35 pounds. This one I was 29 to 25 bale grazing. Their mindset with cattle changes a whole lot when you start grazing cover crops and bale grazing. They don't have that desire to overeat, so they don't chase the feed like they would feeding every day. It's different. I've seen them better health. They're not overeating, they're not over-consuming. Colts were better. As like I said, the nutrition value is there, so I don't have to supplement. Yeah. You know what? I haven't put numbers to it, but what I have heard is it could be upwards to 10%, 12%. But the way I look at it, is it really a loss?
We do that too. We run about 450 head of cows.
Mm-hmm.
But I go out and feed it, every day. Feed every afternoon. I'm just flaking the bales off the feeder.
Right.
But there's times when that feeder's broken down. I've had to just set bales out there. What you see, you set a bale out there and you get 25 cows around it. You get a certain amount of that hay that's just wasted and thrown in the ground.
That's not a waste to me when I can get growth like that. It just increases. So I don't chalk it up for waste. Like I said, there's a lot of guys that'll argue that.
So does all your hay come off that first cutting and you stack that?
Yep. Yep. Now I'm not feeding on alfalfa fields. Like that fallow ground, that's where I'm taking it. So if I've got something in rotation or something I want to build nutrients on, that's where I'll go bale feed. Because I'm keeping cattle on there throughout spring and into early summer, I do have a compaction problem. I've noticed it's less though with the bale grazing because that residue's there, so you don't get that compaction problem near as much. So if you manage it right, they spread it out, they're doing the benefit of not necessarily eliminating it completely, but they reduce the effects of it. The other thing with adding the cover crops is now we've got bees showing up on our place. So we've made a deal with the honey guys that will get honey at wholesale, sell it at retail. So that's just another added or return on investment. Again, had I found a better model, I would have used it, but this is a neighbor. Just kind of demonstrating this is a volunteer cover crop of fall grain and alfalfa. I wanted that armor on the soil. I went into this bottom right-hand picture here is grazing corn. So these fields are getting ready for that grazing corn application. I don't have a roller crimper, so I improvised. I used my swather to knock that residue down. I did not turn the head on. I just put the head on the ground and drove. The only reason I took that picture in the top right is I don't even think I could drive that straight if I had GPS. So I was pretty proud of myself. But that's just one way that we're implementing the cover crops and getting that armor on the soil. And as you can see, both the bale grazing, that picture on the right is the bale grazing. The condition of the cattle at that time still had no supplementation. This particular picture in the middle, that snowstorm right there was enough snow on the ground that cattle didn't go up to drink water for 4 days, so I had to take the chainsaw out and cut the ice out of the water trough. That was not fun. But again, you see the picture, that field on the left there, the condition of them cattle in January just prior to calving. Now, this is where the brass tacks are for me, is right here, is cost of inputs. For me, normally to run my cattle, I'm $1.50 per head per day. That's raising hay, that's feeding my home hay, that's running my own equipment. Now, this is the tricky part, is when you start talking about profitability, is when I'm chasing tonnage on hay, our goal is 6 tons to the acre on alfalfa hay. I can prove to you right here with these numbers that I'm more profitable at 1.5 tons the acre on cover crops than I am chasing yield on alfalfa hay. If it's costing me $1.50 per head per day to raise 6 ton, and it costs me 82 cents per head per day to raise 1.5 tons to feed cattle, hands down I'm more profitable at 1.5 tons than I am at 6. So when we start looking at different ways to integrate these into our own operations, there's also ways that you can bring other entities on. You don't necessarily have to own the cattle to graze or get return on investment. There's cow guys everywhere looking for places to run cattle. There's sheep guys. Take advantage of it. There's more guys that are actually doing these principles that don't have livestock than there are with livestock. So it's doable. Again, this is just one of those anomalies, is that usually when you pull out there with a feed truck, the cattle want the hay, but in this instance, they don't. So I think this is, in agriculture, this is the one thing we hit our heads against all the time, is that every day we get up, we're chastised for the way that we produce food and fiber for not only us, but for the world. And I don't think it has to be that way. You know, these soil health principles, there are failures, there are successes, there are ways to get around them, and the only way we can do that is helping each other. Keith had this one here in his presentation. I didn't take it from him, so it's not a copyright. But it's applicable. You know, when you got presidents, past presidents, that talk about the necessity to take care of our soil for our nation, it hits home pretty hard. You know, and you've got FDR. The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And we've seen it time and time again. As you start reading the books that they're handing out, dirt, that explains the destructions of civilizations from past to present. And I'm not standing on a soapbox when I see this, but when you look at the trouble that we're in health-wise in the United States right now, I mean, we're in a pretty good epidemic when you start to see the cancer rates that we have, neurological diseases, heart diseases, things like that. There hasn't been a time in history where a civilization has been in the trouble that we're in right now, like we're in right now. I mean, it's been centuries that it's been spread out, but when you look at the Green Revolution and what it's done for us health-wise in the last 70 years, that's pretty quick. So it is up to us. Not saying that we're doing it wrong, but we could do it better. This is the reason I get up and do what I do every day. I know that old ways will not open new doors, but we have to lean on those old ways in order to get the door open sometimes. I encourage every one of you to kind of think about what you're doing and how you're doing it and make it applicable to you. I remember having a conversation with my father-in-law, and by the time I was done, I was so frustrated that I wanted to give up. But that's the reason we're in the problem that we're in, is because we're not looking at new ways to do old things. So with that, that's what I have, and if you got any questions, I'll entertain it. Good, I'll go home.
Well, thank Chance.